We, the sovereign Filipino people, imploring the aid of Almighty God in order to build a just and humane society and establish a government that shall embody our ideals and aspirations, promote the common good, conserve and develop our patrimony, and secure to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of independence and democracy under the rule of law and a regime of truth, justice, freedom, love, equality, and peace, do ordain and promulgate this Constitution. In a world filled with numerous great individuals and countless massive countries, very few survive the sands of time and live up to this modern era. Most become history, only being able to know about them in history books and words of mouth. Some countries couldn't adapt, some failed to adjust, and some lost to the survival of the fittest. The Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan, both of which were hailed as the strongest of their eras, still failed to survive and became lost in the history of time. In this documentary, we will discuss about the country which survived up to this date, from its pre-colonial period to its present timeline. We are going to be talking about La Isla Filipina, the Pearl of the Orient Seas, or as we like to call it, the Republic of the Philippines.
Hello everyone, I came from the land of the Philippines. My name is Jaira and I am here to talk about the early Philippine society and how it started and everything. But first, let us know what is a Filipino society. Philippine society is a unique blend of diversity and homogeneity. Forces of assimilation have constantly worked to overcome cultural differences between various ethnic groups that are scattered, sometimes in relative isolation throughout this archipelago. Now let us go to the main topic. So Francisco Colin, one of the most prominent Jesuit missionary and historian of the early colonial period, Colin discusses the customs and traditions of the Philippines, Southeast Asia such as Sumatra and Moluccas. He also studied the local language to understanding of early Filipino society. He discussed their physical appearance, clothing, marriage, eating pattern, song and dance. However, the excerpt below would focus on the social structure, government, and political customs of these Filipino groups of early Filipinos. There were no kings or rulers worthy of mention throughout this archipelago, but there were many chiefs who dominated others less power. Barangay is used to be their form of government. The name barangay is originated from balangay or balangay, a Malay word for sailboat. It may compose of about 30 to 100 families and is ruled by either datu or maginoo. That is all. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Rhea Nicataoca. I'm here to give all of you some ideas about us. Guys, yung law na i-report ko dito katulad ng law natin ngayon, may iba't ibang uri ng law noon. So focus on this and on my documentation. Philippine Act of 1902. The first law passed by the U.S. Congress concerning the government of the Philippines was the Cooper Act, better known as the Philippine Act of 1902. It was passed by the Congress on July 1, 1902. Their law and policy which were not barbarous or barbarian considered ruling tradition and custom. It may be written or not. Unwritten law are spoken laws that is passed by, of course, the word of mouth and may be passed through generation. Guys, pag naubusan sila ng mga bagay na pinagkukuhanan nila ng pagkain, doon lang sila nangangayaw. Yung nangangayaw is sumusugod sila sa ibang poon or bayan para magkaroon ng pagkain. Pag natalo nila yung dato sa bayan na yun, maaari na nilang nirahan yun at magiging malaki sila. Ano nga bang nakakataas sa kanila? Is raha. Raha yung nakakataas sa kanila, which is kung ikukumpara sa panahon natin is mayor. Ang gaha is may anak na Ginoo, kung saan pwede pumalit sa kanila sa darating na panahon, kung sila ay may hinala. Sanduguan is yung pamumuno ng isang bayan at isang bayan. Pag nag-combine sila ng dugo, maaari na silang maging magkakampi at maaari nila matustos ang pangailangan sa isa. So yun lang guys, thank you sa pakikinig.
Good day everyone! I am here to discuss about the three kinds and classes of people. So without further ado, let's go. First is the chief, who the Visayans called Datu and the Tagalogs called Maginoo. It is the chieftain of the whole barangay and the wealthiest person in the community. Datu has many power. In times of peace, he is executive, legislator, and chief justice. In war, he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And in foreign affairs, he enables treaties and truce or sanduguan. How can you be a Datu? It is simply just you can inherit it by a man or a woman. It can also be chosen by the community that has the characteristics of braveness, wealthiest and the wisest person of the barangay. Second is the Timawas, when it's called in Visayan, and Muharika when it is called in Tagalog. They are the intermediate class of men that has their own land. Those who rendered to the rules and they don't work on fields. They can have their own land and don't pay their regular tribute. They are also called a free man. Lastly, the slaves. That is called Oripuen by the Visayans and Alipin by the Tagalogs. Slavery is a system where human is treated as a property. They are forced to work for their masters. Slavery may be due to the following. Number 1, inherited status. Number 2, captured by the enemies in war. Number 3, those who can't pay their debt. Number 4, punishment of the crime they committed. And number 5, sold to become a slave. So, that is the three kinds and classes of people. Bye-bye!
Good morning to all the people that are here and listening to my grandmother's story. My name is Sharina Garcia Mundano and my grandmother is Cristina Garcia. I'm here to tell to you the story of her in the time of Spaniards' colonial period. This video is for all the people who want to know the truth on what happened in the Spaniards' colonial period. They invaded the land of the Native Americans, treating them in an unfriendly and violent manner. When they arrived, the effects of colonization on the native population in the New World were mistreatment of the natives, harsh labor for them, and new ideas about religion for the Spaniards. Spanish rule for the first 100 years was exercised in the most areas through tax farming imported from the Americans and known as the encomienda, but abusive treatment of the local tribute payers and neglect a religious instruction by encomienderos. Collectors the tribute as well as frequent withholding of revenues with the crown caused the Spanish to abandon the system by the end of the 7th century. The Governor-General himself, appointed by the king, began to appoint his own civil and military governors to rule directly. The story was given to me so that I will able to tell the story of my grandmother and the people in the time that are suffering and mistreated by the people that ruled in the Philippines, and that is the Spaniards. I want them to give a special tribute to all the people that are fighting back on the time of the Spaniards and not giving up to give the freedom for this country.
Back in the days when I was not born yet, year 1521 to 1898, the Spanish colonial period of the Philippines began. The Philippines were claimed in the name of Spain in 1521 by Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese explorer sailing for Spain, who named the islands after King Philip II of Spain. They were then called Las Filipinas. By the 1830s, Spanish culture and thought had penetrated into Filipino culture to the extent that the Filipino people began thinking about liberation from Spain. The government of Spain developed Filipino agriculture to the point that it was self-sufficient. After some attempts at independence and an equal number of atrocities on the part of Spain, Filipino nationalists began to speak up. One of the most famous of the time was Jose Rizal. He studied medicine at the University of Santo Tomas in the Philippines and the University of Madrid. Rizal wrote two important novels that portrays the abuses of Spanish rule. Although the books were banned, they were smuggled into the Philippines and widely read. On the night of his execution, on December 30, 1896, Rizal proclaimed the Philippines the Pearl of the Oriental Seas. His death is annually commemorated on December 30. Flag of the Philippines Rizal execution gave impetus to the revolution, although the Filipino rebels, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, did not win complete independence. The Spanish were not able to end the rebellion. In December of 1897, negotiations with Spain resulted in the Pact of the Akna Bato. All of the rebels were granted amnesty and the leaders of the revolution returned in voluntary exile to Hong Kong. While in Hong Kong, Aguinaldo and his compatriots designed what is today the Philippine national flag.
Hello guys, my name is Pamela Ortiz and now I will totally explain what kind of government that Philippines used to have during American era. The history of the Philippines from 1898 to 1946 describes the American colonization. Beginning in 1901, the military government was replaced by a civilian government, the insular government of the Philippine Islands, with William Howard Taft serving as its first Governor General that is appointed by the U.S. President and an elected lower house of the Philippine Assembly. This was a form of territorial government that reported to a Bureau of Insular Affairs. English was then declared as the official language. In socio-economic terms, the Philippines made solid progress in this period. A healthcare system was established which by 1930 that reduced the mortality rate from all causes, including various tropical diseases, to the same level of the United States itself. The practices of slavery, piracy, and headhunting were suppressed but not entirely extinguished. Cultural development strengthened the continuing development of a national identity. Following the passage of Philippine Independence Act in 1934, a Philippine presidential election was held in 1935. Manuel L. Quezon was elected and inaugurated second president of the Philippines on November 15, 1935. The insular government was dissolved and the Commonwealth of the Philippines intended to be a transitional government in preparation for the country's full achievement of independence in 1946. It was brought into existence and then the start of Japanese era.
Hello everyone, I've come from the American era. And to formally introduce myself, I am Marty. And I guess you're wondering why I speak straight English. Well, that's because the Americans happen to value their language. And they have taught us that in our schools.
Could you enlighten us on how the Spanish era suddenly switched to becoming an American era?
Well, that's because on May 1, 1898, the U.S. Navy Admiral George Dewey led the Americans to attack the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay. Emilio Aguinaldo also led the Philippine Revolution as they were assisted. Well then, since they lost, the US decided to pay Spain $20 million. That's where it all started.
In your belief, what do you think made the two countries fight after helping each other to let the Spaniards live?
Specifically, I will say the Filipinos wanted freedom, but the Americans wanted power over us. And that's why, on June 12, 1898, Emilio Aguinaldo declared independence, although the US opposed it, since they had the plans to take over the colony.
What has happened knowing that Emilio Aguinaldo trusted them to set the Philippines free from colonization?
The Philippine-American War lasted 3 years and cost 4,200 Americans and 20,000 Filipinos soldiers to die, including 200,000 Filipino civilians who died from violence. Meanwhile, between these battles, Aguinaldo had no choice but to dissolve the regular army, and it ended with the capture of Aguinaldo by General Frederick Houston on March 1901. Even if the Americans still saw the war as bloody and devastating, so they ended it.
So would you say this government that the Americans had was good? What have they done to bring wellness to the PH?
During his research, Taft concluded and devastated that the great majority of Filipinos did not object to U.S. colonial rule in general sense. They simply reserved their main hostility for America's military government. The Americans took into consideration to the feelings of the Filipinos. That's why they decided to merge. Americans have taught us their language, give us access to free education, religious freedom, and many more. That's why it is the best to conclude that America has made the Philippines a good version of how we were before.
Bataan Death March. The Imperial Japan occupied us during World War II, which was between 1942 and 1945. The Japanese military authorities began organizing new government structures here and promised independence for the islands. On October 1943, they declared that the Philippines is an independent republic. They promised the Filipino societies that they will end the suffering and start a new period of prosperity. But Filipinos continued to witness the harsh experiences of other Filipinos in the hands of the Japanese people. In the early period of the Japanese occupation, the Bataan Death March took place. From April 9 to 17, 1942, from Mariveles, Bataan to San Fernando, Pampanga. It consists of 60 to 80,000 Filipino and American prisoners. In February in the year of 1945, the U.S. Filipino forces began to recapture the Bataan Peninsula. After the war, Lieutenant General Hamo Masaharu, commander of the Japanese invasion forces of the Philippines, was held responsible for the Death March, a war crime, and was executed by a firing squad on April 3 in the year 1946.
A pleasant day to everyone. My name is Lee and this is your tour guide. So for our virtual tour, I will bring, or should I say tour you all in the day of Philippine literature during Japanese period, or the education during the Japanese period here in the Philippines. We all know that the Japanese occupation of Philippines occurred between 1942 and 1945, when Imperial Japan occupied the Commonwealth of the Philippines during World War II. The invasion of the Philippines started on 8 December 1941, 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, historical background between 1942 to 1945. Philippine literature was interrupted in its development when the Philippines was conquered by another country, Japan. Philippine literature in English came to a halt except for the Tribune and Philippine Review. Almost all newspapers in English were stopped by the Japanese. Now, what is the focus of Japanese education in the Philippines? The 6 basic principles of the Japanese education: realization of a new order and promote friendly relations between Japan and the Philippines to the furthest extent. Foster a new Filipino culture base and devote to elevate the morals of the people, giving up overemphasis to materialism. Also, what are the influences of Japan in the Philippine literature? The Japanese form of poetry, haiku, was also explored by Filipino writers during the occupation. Additionally, short stories came more into fashion. Since writing in English was severely limited by the Japanese regime, the vernacular Tagalog language became more widely utilized in literature. That's it for our virtual tour. I hope you all had an idea what happened in education during the Japanese period here in the Philippines. Thank you for joining me.
Mabuhay Pilipinas! I am Senator Torres.
Mabuhay! Hello, I am Senator Ramirez.
And we are going to explain our present government.
I must say that if someone from past centuries, be it 200 or 2,000 years ago, were to time travel to this decade, they would be utterly amazed by our modern technology and its capabilities. But they would be more than familiar with many of the purposes it serves.
I agree. How lucky we are that we have lived in this current period and have full access of what the current type of government is giving to us. The Philippines is governed as a unitary state under a presidential representative and a democratic and a constitutional republic where the president functions as both the head of the state and the head of the government of the country within a pluriform multi-story system. This is made
and social unrest has been around since man first gathered into groups in order to survive. Someone always wants to be in charge, and someone is always unhappy with the way things are. Leaders have always used private or public communication tools and propaganda to gain or maintain power, and those who oppose them have always used the same to overcome them when necessary. This can be a liberating force for good and freedom. There is also a dark side as authoritarian governments, and frighteningly many who claim for freedom use the same tool to monitor their citizens for any decent in order to clamp down and maintain control. Also, now the human rights situation in the Philippines deteriorated in 2020. President Duterte's murderous war on drugs, ongoing since he took office in 2016, continued to target mostly impoverished Filipinos in urban areas. The police and unidentified gunmen linked to the police who have committed thousands of extrajudicial executions. The killings increased dramatically during the COVID-19 lockdown, rising by over 50% during April to July 2020. Compared to the previous 4 months, there has been almost total impunity for these killings.
Sad, but I do agree. With this current issue, the government of our country has been given a lot of criticisms. But I do hope, as far as our country progresses even more in the near future, so does our government and the people behind it. And that's it for the government of the Philippines in the present year.
And there you have it, the Philippines who managed to hold on despite being colonized by so many powers. The Philippines who remained strong despite so many obstacles. The Philippines who continue to live on even in the modern era. This was it for the documentary. We hope you learned something new today, and as always, mabuhay Pilipinas!